Mel Stride, welcome to the Daily Tea Studio. Lovely to have you.
Thank you.
The first question we ask anyone as we have our big yellow teapot here, brewed with tea. If you do like tea, how do you take it?
I take mine with milk, no sugar.
Good, because we
An
don't...
early decision I took, Camilla, that's probably saved me countless pounds on my waistline over the years.
I'm really glad you
Probably
said no
not enough,
sugar,
but
because we
still.
never seem to have any. But
Yeah.
I shall pour you a cup of tea now.
Thank
Gordon,
you.
you're shunning the tea,
I don't drink tea, as you know.
which is weird.
I will ask Mel, as you're pouring his tea, Mel, who would your ideal tea companion be if it could be anybody from history?
Anybody from history? Gosh, so it doesn't have to be somebody alive.
Right,
OK, so I think I'm going to go for a political figure. I'm going to go for an American.
Oh.
I'm going to go for Ronald Reagan,
Okay.
who had this sense of the sunny uplands about him. I think he said that every morning was good morning in America, and that's how I'd like our country to be. He also said that he deplored Conservatives attacking Conservatives, and I thoroughly subscribe to that. So, Ronnie Reagan, here's to you.
All right, no blue on blue.
Good
That's
answer.
No
what we're
blue on
getting
blue.
First sense. Look, Mel, it's fair to say, I think, that you're probably the least known of all of the candidates standing to be the next Tory leader. Is that fair? So
I think I've got a rapidly increasing profile, actually, Camilla. And during the general election campaign, I think I fronted up about 25% of the morning round.
Yeah.
Now, I did that because I had courage and I wanted to put my head above the parapet, take the incoming, because I cared about my colleagues winning their seats, okay? And I think that was noticed by my colleagues in Parliament. So bear in mind, of course, this contest is amongst the members, but it's also amongst parliamentarians. And I think my profile there is pretty strong.
I agree. We have described you in this briefing note as Mr. Broadcast Round.
Yeah.
And it was noted, and we chatted, didn't we, on GB News, and then
Yeah.
it was a bit of a running joke during the election. Who's
Yeah.
on the broadcast round? It's poor old Mel Stride.
I know. Well, look, I did GMB 8 times.
Oh, God.
And every time I went on, they put another sliver of a still of me the last times that I'd been on. And in the end, I was cramped into this tiny little box at the end. And I think it was between me and Wes Streeting as to who got the golden boot.
Yes.
But it was me.
It was you.
I was the winner.
Okay, so let's just go through a little mini biography of you, Mel. You're 62. You were born in Ealing. You went to Oxford University, where you studied politics, philosophy, and economics, and you were president of the Oxford Union, as many Tory leadership contenders, I think, probably have been. Then you started a business which you sold.
Ooh, are you absolutely minted, Mel?
I did okay. I did
Did
okay
you?
by taking risks, working with teams of people and building businesses from scratch, both here and in the United States.
So self-made man.
Yeah,
we call
I
Mel
would
the
say so.
self-made man.
Yeah,
Okay.
and I went into Parliament in my later 40s, having done all that, and having done something out there in the real world, and I think that brought something to my parliamentary career, actually.
Okay, so you were elected as the MP for Central Devon in 2010. You voted Remain in the EU referendum.
We won't hold that against you, Mel.
That's all right. Look, that's history, as you said.
Yeah.
You know.
You became Financial Secretary to the Treasury under Theresa May and then Leader of the Commons. You backed Michael Gove for the leadership in 2019 when Boris Johnson won. Then you backed Rishi Sunak as leader when Liz Truss won.
Can I just interject there? Why didn't you back Boris Johnson?
I thought that Michael had the right temperament for the role,
Ah,
and I'll leave others to judge whether that judgment was right or not.
Okay.
okay, fair
But I'm a
enough.
great
fair
Boris
answer.
fan
I
too.
presume you
because I
thought that-
recognise the magic charisma that he has. But nonetheless, I thought at that time Michael would have been the better option.
And did you think that Sunak was temperamentally better than Liz Truss?
I thought his ideas on the economy were absolutely the right ones. And that meant sometimes saying the things that people didn't want to hear, but were the responsible things to say. And the first thing we've got to do as a party is make sure that we are seen as being economically competent. So I was chair of the Treasury Select Committee, as you know, for 3 years, as well as Financial Secretary to the Treasury with the responsibility for the whole of the UK's tax. And I think that's something that I would bring to the party.
Okay. Just to round that off, you were Work and Pensions Secretary from 2022 until the election. You're now the Shadow Work and Pensions Secretary, and you're married to Michelle, and you have 3 daughters.
I do.
Are
There
they
we have
grown
it.
up, or are they still at
Are
school?
they grown up? So, yes, the eldest is sort of in her mid-20s and out at work and doing things. The other 2 are still at home.
Okay.
So they're approaching A-levels and GCSEs. So
Okay.
Oh,
that will be a fraught time.
Mel, we
I
know that
think.
feeling.
I
Good luck
know,
to you.
But we get through it, don't we? I still have nightmares about exams, actually.
So do I.
30 years after I did them. They really are traumatic.
Do you mean your
But-
own A-levels or GCSEs
Yeah,
or
yeah,
your
yeah.
children?
Yeah.
thing.
I
Yeah.
have nightmares about having to
you never
resit
quite
them.
escape, do you?
Actually, I have a nightmare about having to do my whole law degree again, and it's
Yeah.
awful. But enough of our nightmare. Maybe that should be
There's
one
a whole
of the questions.
podcast about
Maybe
that, I
that
think.
should be the question. What's your recurrent
Well,
nightmare?
Yeah.
Mel, before we get into the nitty-gritty of what you believe, what you're standing for, why you're running in this election, because we've got you here and you are obviously in the shadow cabinet, can we just get your reaction to what's been going on overnight, over the last few nights, the Southport incident,
Yeah.
these riots outside Downing Street last night?
Yeah.
I mean, it's a very troubling time for people sort of watching Britain and thinking, is this evidence that it is, as Nigel Farage and others claim, broken?
So look, these terrible, terrible situations periodically visit us in different forms. I think we need to look at it at several different levels, really. One is the law and order response and how we deal with it. And there I think we have to be robust. And I see the police, I think, generally being that in this instance. But I think there are deeper problems around social media and misinformation and even manipulation by outside states. And there's some suggestion, for example, that Russia may have been involved in some of the messaging around this. And I think there's a whole slew of issues around that needs a lot of detailed and careful thought, not least because, of course, the advent of artificial intelligence means that is only going to get worse in terms of deep fake material as well as misinformation. And so I think there's a lot of thinking that we need to absolutely do on that. And really, I suppose those are my main thoughts on it. And I think it behoves politicians to be responsible in the way in which they respond. And I think some comments that seem to lean into, well, we're not being told the whole truth, are we, for example, tend to stir things up rather than dampen things down, which is what we want.
Do you agree with Angela Rayner that the English Defence League should be proscribed?
I think it should be looked at. I think the problem with prescription always, of course, is that these folks crop up in some other guise fairly rapidly. So you have to look at how effective that is going to be. But clearly I have absolutely no truck with Tommy Robinson and his ilk and what they're doing to exploit this situation.
Moving on to the Tory leadership, Mel, I suppose the first question is, why?
Because I think our party is a particular juncture and a very difficult one. We've just had a crushing defeat, lost 2/3 of our seats, 20 points in the polls. We polled just a little bit better than the Lib Dems did in 2010. Now, I don't think all is lost. I think there are many reasons why we can come back in one term. But I think that is going to need a leader, first and foremost, who unites our party, particularly the parliamentary party. And I think I'm very well placed to do that. We've talked about what I've done in my past, leader of the House of Commons, chair of the Treasury Select Committee. Those tend to be roles where you reach out, in fact, in those cases, right across the whole of Parliament to bring people together. And I think my political positioning and pragmatism probably would lend itself to bringing right, left, centre. I don't like labels, but we all know what that means together. The second thing is we're going to need somebody who's going to be able to drive fundamental change within the Conservative Party. Now, I've demonstrated that in welfare, where the reforms that I brought in are once-in-a-generation reforms that, for example, with work capability assessments, means, according to the OBR, we're going to see 400,000 fewer people on long-term sickness and disability benefits, for example. As a consequence, I set up my own business, as we've just discussed, which means bringing teams together and pursuing objectives and doing that, literally starting from scratch, both here and in the United States. And I believe that that kind of approach can lend a lot to that change. But what does that change mean? I think first and foremost, it has to be a changed policy offering, which has to be worked up through time, and we have plenty of time. There is no magical ideological square upon which we can leap now to solve all our problems in one go. We've got to do the hard yards to get there, and I think I'd be well placed to take us on that journey. And that means coming up with the answers to how do we attract those that have gone to reform, as well as not forgetting the so-called centre ground, the common ground that we need to be focusing on. And the final thing I would say is some of this is organisational. We do not have the election campaigning machine that we should have. It's over-centralised, it's out of touch with its membership. Our membership has been declining on and off for many years. We've got a big electoral challenge in May. We've already been hollowed out in terms of our councillors up and down the country, which makes winning in 5 years' time that much harder. So there are all sorts of fundamental and very rapid reforms that we're going to have to bring in terms of being a lean, mean, fighting machine that we need to be. And so those are some of the things. I have a very strong vision, incidentally, as to where we need to go. And I think I would start by saying, what have we lost sight of as a Conservative Party? Now, Conservative means many different things, but at its heart has got to be aspiration and opportunity. And we've come to be in a world, and I think there are perfectly explicable reasons why this has happened, in which that has been crowded out by big government and the big state. So if you go back to the financial crisis 2007-8, you saw a drop in productivity and growth levels thereafter. That in itself actually meant that, given the additional demands on the state that there are, including areas like health, etc., that the scope for getting taxes down, for example, was severely squeezed, exacerbated by COVID, when the government had to step in and start paying people's wages, extraordinary thing that it had to do, right thing to do, but extraordinary. And then the cost of living crisis, in which once again government steps in, pumps billions of pounds in transfer payments to low-income households to get them through. All of that adds up to a situation in which that flame of aspiration and opportunity and low taxes and all the things that are in that space has been squeezed out. Now, the solution is going to rest with what the Labour Party are actually talking about, which is greater growth and higher productivity. If we had the productivity level of the United States or Germany, the economy would be 16% bigger. Overnight, there's a huge prize. So there are lots of issues around how you do that. But my vision is that we do all that hard work. In welfare, I've shown how it can be done. I actually had a plan that went into our manifesto that would have provided £12 billion of savings that was 2/3 of the cost of the national insurance cuts that we were offering the British people at that time. We can do that over and over and over again to get into a position where we have leaner, more efficient public services, but we have that space to channel and champion and celebrate and drive all that aspiration and opportunity. What's Labour's answer? Well, they're going in the same direction, they think, on growth and productivity. Let's see if they get there. But what they want to channel that extra space into is ever more centralised command and control government. And we've seen it in the King's speech. So we've seen there, for example, nationalisation of the railways. We've seen this national wealth fund that's going to be set up with billions of pounds. We've seen the energy body that they're going to, Great British Energy, that they're going to set up with 7 or 8 billion. We've seen the attitude towards the trade unions and strengthening them, and they will be coming along and asking for their payout along the way without any requirement for productivity increases in response, as we've seen indeed with the junior doctors. So that's their direction of travel. I want to do all that hard work on getting growth and productivity moving. I want to create the space, but I want to channel it into conservative values with aspiration and opportunity right at its heart.
Mel, can I ask you, I think that the Tory leadership election is being framed, quite rightly probably, as people on the right of the party against people on the centre or in the centre of politics. 2 questions. Where would you define yourself on that sort of scale between, the right and the centre? And is it easier for somebody on the right to unite the party by coming towards the centre, or is it easier for somebody from the centre to unite the party by moving towards the right?
I think uniting the party, if you mean by that the parliamentary party, I think moving from where the candidates are at the moment, in the terms that you've expressed it, is not the answer, actually. Because I think, to a degree, moving or shape-shifting will be seen for what it is. I think you kind of start where you are, and you kind of stay where you are in that sense.
But where are you in the spectrum?
So I would say that I am a pragmatic Conservative that is prepared to take the time to listen to people and to come up with solutions that unite us around Conservative values. I've already set out some of what my vision is, and that does include meaning that we need less government, not more of it.
So you're a small statist and you're a low taxist.
Yes.
Are you somebody that wants to leave the ECHR, for instance?
So on the ECHR, I think it would be a big mistake to too starkly paint any candidate, to too starkly paint their position in at this stage. And there are 2 reasons for that, amongst others, Camilla. One is that whoever wins this race has got to go back to the parliamentary party and say, I am your leader, I'm now going to bring you together. And what you don't want is too many in the rank and file there saying, but hold on a minute, you've taken a position on this, this and this, which I'm afraid I cannot sign up to. And I think on some of the issues, including that one, that is a distinct danger. The second thing is, I think there is too much urgency, in a sense, amongst some of us to leap onto some of these issues and come to hard and fast, stark conclusions about them, stakes in the sand, etc., right up front. And I know that appeals probably to many in the membership. But we've got 5 years, Camilla. There's not going to be an election now for another 5 years. And what we have got to do now is to take that mature, measured approach to coming to the solutions around ECHR and other matters and get that right and do it taking the parliamentary party with us. If we don't take the parliamentary party with us, it doesn't matter what the conclusions are, we will not succeed. But can I just say
it's hard just to interrupt on that.
Yes.
I mean, isn't this sort of wishy-washy consensus position of being all things to all men and women in the Conservative Party how the Tories have ended up in this mess? You've quoted Reagan as somebody you wanted to have a cup of tea with. You know, he's fairly unequivocal on what he believed in and what he stood for. And you're sort of saying, well, I'm the unity candidate, therefore I need to make sure that I can take everyone in the party with me. You can't take everyone in the party with you because there's a massive gulf between, say, Suella Braverman on the right and your rival Tom Tugendhat on the left.
So leadership is about, in part, pragmatism, okay? And it's, in part, getting to a point where people have gone with you and have agreed on a direction. Now, once you agree that direction, you have to hold to it.
But you have to lead as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I can be as tough as they come. And getting back down to that news round, when I was going out day in, day out, right, getting up early in the morning, being in the studios at 6:30, taking the Brit bats coming towards me, facing enemy fire, I was the one that did it. I was the one that had the courage to go and do that. So I will lead in that style. I won't shrink away from anything. But we have to take people with us.
All right, Mel, come on now. You're not going over the top, you know, from the trenches. You're doing a broadcast round, defending a government that admittedly was on its knees.
I was one of the very few that actually stood up and was counted at
So
that
are you
point,
saying that other Conservative colleagues at the time were shirking their responsibilities?
I was one of the very few who stood up, and so I don't think anybody stood up to the degree that I did to defend our seats.
So were you offering yourself up, or was CCHQ saying, Mel, come on, do another broadcast round?
It was a combination of both. I made it very clear to the centre that I was prepared to do whatever I possibly could to defend our seats up and down the country.
But do you think others shirked their responsibilities on that?
Because we did
wonder why you were on the broadcast round so much. Where was everybody else?
Well, that's a question you need to ask everybody else. But all I'm making, I'm not going to point a finger at anybody at all, to get back to my Ronnie Reagan's first rule of politics, at all. But I make the point. You've rightly challenged me and said, look, if you're a pragmatist, doesn't that mean you're just wishy-washy and you don't stand for anything? Absolutely not. But it does mean on certain issues that could be deeply divisive within the parliamentary party that we need to unite. We need to reach agreement across the parliamentary party on those matters, but we need to take people with us when we do it. Now, and Margaret Thatcher took exactly the same approach. I mean, some people say at the end she slightly lost the plot, but the reality was that Maggie was a pragmatist too. She could just dive in and forge a direction irrespective of other people. She did work with other people, but she had a clear sense of vision, some of which I've outlined to you a little while ago, and I have that. But she also recognised that you had to bring people together in a common endeavour. But once you struck your direction, that's it. You go for it, and you lead, and you stand by it. And that's exactly what I will do.
To put the question another way, and maybe if you were to try and answer this in a sentence, what would you say your USP is?
I think I'm a unifier that can drive change.
But is that a USP? Because isn't that what everyone is going to say?
I think I am putting myself forward as the person who I believe is the best and most likely person to be that unifier that can bring us together to drive the change that we need. I think I can get that job done. And in my life, I've done exactly those things. When you start a business from a kitchen table, from scratch, and you go through all the twists and turns and the horror show that business can be, as well as all the excitement, that takes leadership to do that, to build teams of people, to build a company from scratch. And I'm not talking about going into other people's businesses and turning them around. I'm talking about doing it from the bottom up. I'm talking about going to the United States, setting up a business with a team of people. It was me. It was my individual endeavour, 100%, and leading that, and then ending up selling that business in the States and so on. Hopping on and off aeroplanes, zooming around all over the place, doing deals, getting stuff happening and done. You have to know where you're going to get to, and you have to know how you're going to get there, and you have to put the determination and the energy to do it. And that's what I will bring to this. This is what most people say they want. Most people say they don't want people that have been hanging around politics all their life.
No, that's true.
I went into Parliament age 48.
Yes.
Okay.
What? Again, why?
Because at the age of 48, I felt that having grown those businesses, having done all that stuff, that I had something to offer. I had some experience to offer.
You're almost a direct contemporary of Keir Starmer, aren't you? Because you're the same.
We're the same age.
Almost the same age.
Yeah.
And you started at the same sort of time. So
we actually also went to the same college at one point.
Oh, there you go.
Did you?
There you go.
Are you friends across the political divide?
I've spoken to Keir a few times, and we've got on absolutely fine. Yeah. And I do think in politics, actually, people sort of tend to forget that there are many friendships actually across the aisle, and quite rightly so, because at the end of the day, we're all human beings, and most people are in it for the right reasons and trying hard to do their best.
Mel, despite your youthful complection, that does make you the oldest candidate.
The most experienced candidate, Camilla.
You're channeling your inner Reagan there.
Yeah, I am. It was that wonderful incident when he talked about, I won't do you down for your lack of experience if you didn't go on about my age. No, as you say, about the same age as Keir Starmer. Lots of experience to bring and lots of energy to give.
Is it wise for the Conservatives to elect a leader who has a majority of just 61?
Yeah, absolutely. So the reason I'm in Parliament is I survived, okay? And I fought tooth and nail. I fought tooth and nail to survive. And in fact, many safer seats were lost. And if the corollary of that question is that our aspiration should be to worry about a seat that we've won in this election, rather than going and taking back the safer seats that we lost and many others, then that's not a good starting point. So I understand. Look, I when I was first selected, I fought the Liberal Democrats and I beat them. And I've beaten Labour 3 times over, including in this landslide that swept away many of my neighbours, sadly, in Devon. I know what it takes to win at the local level. And that's why, in the response to your earlier question, we've got to fundamentally reform the campaigning machine that we've got. There are many things that are deficient there, and we've got to do it quickly.
And a lot of campaigners just stayed at home because they were so annoyed at Rishi Sunak calling the election early when they weren't ready. Is that not the case?
Well, it's easy to say that without knowing the counterfactual, and we'll never know the counterfactual, what would it have been like if he'd waited another few months. But I think, to the generality of your point, you're right. Clearly, a number of mistakes were made in that campaign. But I think that as a party, what we've got to do is to get through that kind of grieving and anger stage as quickly as we can. Okay, we've got to move on. We've got to have it, and we've got to learn from it, but we mustn't dwell on it. So what I want to do is very rapidly refocus our party on the future rather than raking over what's happened in the past.
Are you likely to win this leadership race? I ask that not unkindly, but if you look at the bookies and if you look at any of the polls, the Telegraphs, the Con Home poll, you're way at the bottom. And then that begs the question, if you're not going to do it, are you just in the race to raise your profile?
Not at all. I've got no interest in simply raising profile for profile's sake whatsoever. All I would say is, look, this is a longer race, and it's a longer race quite deliberately. It's a longer race so that those who are not necessarily perceived as the immediate automatic victors, that others are given the profile and the time to actually develop what it is they stand for. There are many surprises in politics. We've talked about David Cameron, and we've talked about that there was a point when many were urging him to actually just drop out of the race. You're not going to get there. Don't waste your time. Don't get in the way. And this is what a lot of your opponents will say, of course. But look what happened. He went on and he won. Look what happened after the 2019 election. If I was a socialist sitting here, and you would be saying to me, you've had the worst electoral defeat since the 1930s. You're going to be out of power for generations. You may never come back into power. Well, look what Keir Starmer did. He's now gone an absolute landslide. There are no rules in politics, and there will be no hard and fast rules in that sense in this contest.
Let's imagine that you don't get through, who would your pick be out of the other candidates?
I'd be happy to stand against any of the candidates in the final two, and I respect all of them. And I think each and every one of them actually individually has some very significant strengths. And my commitment is very clear that if I do not prevail, I will support whoever wins this contest 110%, because I'm very serious about the importance of us coming together as a parliamentary party.
But if you're not in the final two, I mean, who are you closest to of all of the candidates, all of your rivals?
Do you know what, Camilla? I'm going to avoid sort of getting drawn into, I'm a bit like this one, a bit more, less like that one, and so on. Look, I think we all have a lot to offer. I've set out what I think I have in particular. I think that I do have that capacity to unite. I think I have that capacity to take us on that journey, which is going to be a really tough journey, to come up with the right answers, the right vision, the right solutions to win back those that have gone for reform, as well as those in the centre, those Labour and Liberal Democrat voters, and that I can reform the party machine in time for us to prevail in those May elections. That's the platform generally that I am standing on.
Okay, you just mentioned reform. If you did win the leadership, how would you deal with the threat of reform and Nigel Farage's star power? What does the Tory party need to do about reform?
Well, what we don't need to do is to get into bed with Nigel Farage or permit Nigel Farage to join the Conservative Party. He's made it very clear that he wants to destroy the Conservative Party. So there's no question of that. But what we must do is respect and reach out to and understand and come up with a solution to the very legitimate concerns of people that voted for reform. Let's not kid ourselves, they were all going to vote Conservative. About a third might have done. About 17% might have gone to Labour or the Liberal Democrats, and a whole bunch of them would not have come to us under any circumstances. Okay, so it's not just a case of suddenly miraculously taking all those votes and putting them into our column. But the way we do it is we have a serious offer around migration, illegal migration, low taxation, those kind of issues that really matter to those voters. Now, some people say, oh, they're right-wing issues. I say, no, they're not. They're common ground issues. In fact, if you poll Liberal Democrats, they care quite a lot about migration, for example. So I think it is by understanding and respecting, absolutely respecting those people who chose to vote reform and having the right platform to win them back.
Can we ask you some policy questions, but we would like quite cogent sort of practical answers rather than, yes, I want to bring down legal migration and end illegal migration. Can you try and tell us how you might do that? So presumably you do want to do both of those things on immigration.
Yes. Yeah, of course.
What policy ideas would you put in a Mel Stride manifesto on immigration?
So on getting migration down, clearly that's a journey we're already on. It's due to about halve over the next year. The number of visa applications about down a third, I think, on the beginning of this year, and that's because of reforms that the last government brought into the visa arrangements. And I think we need to look at going still further in that direction.
A cap on the numbers?
We need to, potentially, but what we need to be doing also is we need to be looking at the labour market. And we need to be working out exactly how it is that we fill those spaces and reskill and retrain people to make sure that the demand side for migration is reduced, as well as reducing just the supply. And there's a whole load of things that we could talk about around the labour market. On illegal migration, there is no doubt in my mind that unless you have an effective deterrent for people coming here, the policy will not work. Now, we saw with Rwanda, not loads of planes going off, unfortunately, because we had a general election and Keir Starmer has now cancelled the whole thing. But we did see the first signs of deterrence working. We saw people over in Calais hesitating to come over until there was a new government and their friend Mr Starmer was in place. We saw people going from Northern Ireland over to the Republic of Ireland because they were fearful of the consequences of the legislation that we were bringing through. We saw what happened when we had the returns deal with Albania, which was a clear deterrent. If you're Albanian, you came over here, you went straight back to Albania. That dropped by over 90% almost overnight.
So you're saying you'd bring back Rwanda?
I'm saying that we need to have a deterrent policy.
Is it the Rwanda scheme?
We need to look at third countries, absolutely. We need to look at that. But these are things, Camilla, and this isn't ducking the question because I think I've set out some very clear principles here, that if we're going to have an effective answer, and we've got 5 years and time to do that, I'm not saying we take 5 years, but we have plenty of time to do it, you would be crazy to start saying, absolutely here on your programme, this is my precise
But
approach.
you like the idea of overseas processing of
I think that could,
migrants.
That could certainly be, and look, it's the way that Europe themselves are looking. So Rishi Sunak went over to Austria and met with the leaders there, and various countries are actually very interested now in the proposals that we were developing and putting forward. Okay. So we're not alone on that.
You used to work in the Treasury.
Yeah.
If you were to become Prime Minister, which tax would you cut first?
I'd certainly go for those taxes which I think are LAFA taxes, and by that I mean those where you can actually cut the rate and increase the yield. I don't think there are as many of them as some people seem to think they are.
What are you thinking of then?
So stamp duty land tax on properties, for example. So where at the upper end you're now paying amazingly 12%. I mean, people focus on the lower end, but right the way through. And the problem with that tax is that it's a transaction-based tax, so the higher it is, the less properties are bought and sold. There are knock-on consequences of slowing down property sales, which are all the painters and decorators and furnishers and all that, white van man brigade that we want to support in this country, get cut out. There's less of that going on. So I think that is a deeply regressive tax. I think also some of the duties, actually, even on things like cigarettes and tobacco, etc., are probably, because they're so high, leading to so much counterfeiting and smuggling that actually the tax take is being undermined more than it's being supported by increases in those kind of areas. But more generally, I would be looking at those taxes that are about driving work and economic activity. So there, I think we were absolutely right to go for national insurance, for example, as a very important tax to keep getting down. And we clearly in the election set out a trajectory to abolish national insurance altogether for employees. So I think that is broadly where I would go.
Don't you want to cut corporation tax as a former businessman and self-made millionaire? Can I call you that?
Call me whatever you like.
Well, is that accurate?
Well,
he's not denying it.
Successful. Let's say successful. Let's say successful.
But you don't want corporation tax 6% higher than it was, do you?
No, I want all those taxes as low as possible, including corporation tax. I think there's an important point, Camilla, because those that advocate cuts in corporation tax, I think, sometimes confuse causation with coincidence. And what they point to is the fact that when corporation tax was being reduced, the tax take went up, and that did indeed happen from the 2010s onwards. But there are also a number of other factors that are coincidentally in play, such as growth in the economy. There were various tax avoidance measures that were brought in that yielded very large amount. There was the surcharge on banking going on at the same time, things that actually drove more tax take at the same time as these rates were coming down. Corporation tax rates are about the lowest in the G7. So they're not absolutely
not as low as
astronomical,
Ireland's, are they?
But we absolutely want to get them down. Absolutely.
You mentioned housing and people moving house. How would you solve the housing crisis?
So we are going to have to look at how we get that balance right between listening to local communities and not dumping housing on them, which I think is what we're beginning to see with the Labour Party's approach, where they've reduced the requirements on London, for example. On areas like mine, they're seeking 50% more housing being built. But I think there's far more we can do in these sort of brownfield areas, in allowing higher rise properties, greater densities and so on, to get us through that. But that once again is something that something that we need to work on as a party to come up with exactly the right formulation that's going to hold us together and will work, because we've got to get those numbers up. Now Labour are saying 1.5 million over this Parliament. We delivered 2.5 million since 2010, 1 million in the last Parliament, but those numbers, of course, were not enough. We do need to get those figures up.
On NHS and social care, what would you do? Or what would be your... I know it's hard to answer that question, so how about this? What would be your top priority?
So the top priority on the NHS is an organisational and operational priority, because more and more money has gone into the National Health Service. Nobody can credibly say we have not supported the NHS by putting more money into it. In real terms, it's shot up since 2010. We have about 1.3 million people working in the National Health Service. And yet productivity in the NHS in particular, and across the public sector more generally, has stagnated, and in some cases it's actually gone into reverse despite the extra cash. Some of that is because a lot of that money has gone into paying people salaries, as opposed to investing in the technology and the infrastructure and the things that, for example, a modern business would have to leverage the output of its employees. So one of the things I would do would be a huge piece of work around how we get that balance more appropriately sorted, and how we get technology and infrastructure and so on, and the systems, all these massive different computer systems that don't talk to each other, all this paperwork. We've all had experience of going and dealing with the NHS. And so often when we get to see the right person, it's fantastic. But that journey to actually getting there is not something that you experience when you go to a number of well-run private companies that have a completely different approach. So I think those are really important things that we grapple with. And if we don't do that, it's just going to get worse and worse, because the demand for health, because of demographic shifts, is going to continue to go up. We're all living longer. We also have higher demands as to what we expect from the health service. Back in my grandmother's day, the idea of going in and out and having a hip replaced in a very short period of time would have been quite inconceivable. Now we expect it as standard. And the cost of treatments, robotics in surgery and new drugs that do all sorts of wonderful things are expensive. And if we're going to have any chance of ever getting into the square where the public says, do you know what, we're really, really, really satisfied with the NHS, it's going to need to be fundamentally reformed in terms of the productivity of that service.
Okay. We're going to ask you some quickfire questions now.
Right.
We're going to try and find out a bit more about you.
Okay.
By asking you about things like your leisure time and what you like to do when you're not talking about policy.
Okay.
So, quick answers. What was the last novel that you read?
Gosh, the last novel. It's not a novel. I was part way through, but because of this contest, had to drop Napoleon, the biography of Napoleon by Andrew Roberts, which is a thoroughly good read.
Novel, though, is it?
It's not a novel.
We said novel
all right,
because
you
we
did
knew
say novel.
people would say.
Okay, no,
we
that's
knew
fair
people
enough.
would say
Okay.
non-fiction.
They'd all be reading
That's fair
critical
enough.
biographies.
Right. Okay. The answer is I can't remember the last novel that I read. But what I would say on novels is I'm very drawn to American writers, say your Steinbecks and Baldwins and
All right, good to know.
Chandlers and people like them, Faulkner and people like that.
What are you currently binge watching?
I'm not a great binge watcher.
Oh,
I have
come
to say
on,
my
Mel.
wife. Look, I'm sorry, Camilla. This is ridiculous, right? This is basically saying I've got to have an answer to the future of the NHS. I've got to win the Tory party leadership. I've got to,
watching.
I've got to do whatever I've got to do. And do you know what? I don't spend hours on end watching
No, all right.
TV.
Let's go with what was the last thing you binge watched?
Well, last thing, Breaking Bad. I watched the whole of that, and that is a marathon, actually.
Yes.
And I just adored it.
Okay.
I thought it was absolutely... Walter White? He was the main character. I just thought it was incredible. So there we are.
Which film have you watched more than any other?
Citizen Kane or Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, probably. Probably Citizen Kane.
Nice.
I think the greatest movie of all time.
Fair play.
Nobody's going to argue with that.
Yeah.
What was your first car?
My first car was a Mercedes sports car.
Ooh.
I see.
It was a very long time ago.
I think you're now answering the question about whether you're minted.
Whether I'm into it. Well, look, you can get battered old Mercedes sports cars that
All
are barely
right.
start.
Fair
Let's
enough.
not get carried away. I was very young. I was in my 20s. And I loved it because it had a nice big easy rolling steering wheel.
Nice.
What
colour was it?
It was red.
Oh,
actually.
lovely.
Yeah, not my politics, but it was great, and I just loved it. And it had the sort of manual. You had to sort of put the roof down manually and sort of pull over to a lay-by and put it out, and pack it away, and all the rest of it.
What would be your McDonald's order?
Probably, I did go through a phase of going to McDonald's for a while, actually, for breakfast.
When was this?
And I got out. This was some years ago.
Before the broadcast round.
This was before the broadcast round. Yes, absolutely. I do like their McMuffins.
Yes.
The breakfast McMuffin. I think the double is just too much. I prefer the sausage to the bacon.
Fair
personally.
enough.
There's a bit too much
with
fat
you on
on the bacon, but once in a while, a single McMuffin, sausage McMuffin. Is
Nothing
perfect.
worse than turning up at 11:01 and being told, sorry.
The breakfast menu's over. Yes.
Okay. Sticking with a food theme, what is your favourite flavour of crisps?
I'm a traditionalist there. I think I'll go salt and onion.
Salt and
Salt
onion.
and onion, yeah.
Hang on
That's
a minute.
not right, is it?
We didn't ask
I
you to
can't do
invent a
that,
flavour
can I?
of crisp.
I go for, what is it, salt and vinegar, isn't it? Yeah, salt and vinegar. You can tell I'm a crisp eater, can't you?
Do you have a favourite hobby?
Yeah, I do. I love history. And as a hobby, only as a hobby, I qualified as a tour guide. So I'm qualified to guide the British Museum, Westminster Abbey and St Paul's Cathedral and Windsor Castle, Stonehenge, all those kind of places, Tower of London. And it was just the most amazing experience. It took me a couple of years to do it.
When did you do this?
Oh, gosh, 10... before I was elected, must have been 20 years ago now. And what's great is that you learn about history by going around and looking at things. Okay, so to stand in front of an object and to discuss history is far more evocative and powerful than reading about it in a book.
Wow.
And so I adored it. And it also makes you see things rather differently. You know, as you walk around, you look at things, you spot things, you know about things, you understand what a street name suggests and so on, or you know why there's a dip in the road there, because that's where the River Fleet lies beneath the road even today, disgorging into the Thames. Whatever it may be, it gives you a sense of place and belonging, I think, to understand the city or the place that you're in.
What's the
in a
most
historical
fascinating
way.
thing that you discovered when you were doing tour guiding?
That's a really good... Well, I'll tell you two things. One which wasn't so much fascinating, was an extraordinary thing that happened, was I did actually... It was a hobby, but I did actually take a few groups out. I did probably no more than 10 once I qualified. One was 53 Americans on a coach. We did the change of the guard at Buckingham Palace and various panoramic sites around. And I was always told, rule number one is make sure you keep everybody together. Well, after the first stop, I'd lost 3. After the second stop, I was up to about 8 or something.
Oh, dear.
And by the third stop, I'd lost about, a good third of them. But the amazing thing was, and I think this is because they were go-getting, resourceful Americans full of energy, by the end, they'd all caught up with me and we all ended up back together. Most extraordinary things is, what's the oldest structure in London, would you say? It's a Roman city originally, of course.
Oh,
but
God.
what would you think? How old is it?
Oh, I'm terrible at these sorts of things.
Is it the London Wall?
No, that's a good guess. So you're going back there to, 1300 or thereabouts, or
Roman
a
structures.
bit, Roman parts of it a bit earlier.
I've got my native Verulamium in mind, but obviously that's St Albans and nothing to do with London.
no.
Well, there are Roman temples, aren't there?
It actually
there?
comes from Egypt. It's Cleopatra's
Oh,
Needle. It's
Cleopatra's
about 2,500 years old.
Yeah.
And underneath the base of it, there's a box, a little time box. This was put up in Victorian times, and there are Victorian train timetables in there, and there are photographs of the most beautiful women in the world in there, including Queen Victoria, which was probably a sensible thing to have done.
Probably an early photo of her.
Oh, yeah, an early photo,
Be honest.
taken from a distance at a certain
During the
angle,
Albert
perhaps.
years.
Yeah, perhaps.
I tell you what, if this leadership doesn't work out for you, Mel, I feel another Telegraph podcast coming on.
You see another
also
career
you've got-
beckoning.
You do
Yes.
have another career that you're already qualified to do.
And finally, what was the last song you listened to on your phone? Or if you didn't listen to a song on your phone because you're not that way inclined, the last song that you listened to and maybe had a little sing-along to.
Right, a little bit of a sing-along too.
You can check your phone.
I like the... yeah, I could do it. It'd take me too long, I think. But I like the Rolling Stones, so it was probably a Stones number. What might I have listened to? Sway, one of the lesser-known tracks on the Sticky Fingers album. I'm particularly drawn to. It's got a touch of Citizen Kane about it, actually. That
Yes,
sort of,
we've come full circle on our
yeah, we
rapid-fire
have, haven't we?
questions.
Yeah, so probably that.
Mel Stride, thank you for being such a good sport. All the very
you.
best of luck with this Tory leadership race, because it is a marathon, not a sprint. And we shall be following it every step of the way. And congratulations on being the first leadership candidate to appear on our Daily Tea Leadership Candidate Special.
It's been a great pleasure, and even the tea was good, Camilla. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Mel.